So I'm presenting a solution called Möbius, which is a tumbler for Ethereum. So this is introduced very nicely by the previous work, because this is a way to make tumbling and like mixing more frictionless, so that these intersection attacks would like have to work over a larger range. So to introduce the problem, Bitcoin, as we know, isn't very anonymous. Like very easily you can track money through the ledger, and this is how clustering attacks work. So you can see there's these like very obvious links between sender and recipients in this case. So everyone knows that Bitcoin isn't private, so what is privacy is the next question that we would want to ask. So we have different notions of privacy. So for a single transaction, we would have sender anonymity, which means that the recipients in question don't know which blockchain address corresponds to their specific sender, which would be the case if you use this naive solution of using this like ideal trusted tumbler that sits in the middle, that is here represented as the Bitcoin bath. And the way that this solution would work is that Charlie and Alice, wanting to send money to Dora and Bob, would just give the money to this Bitcoin bath and give the addresses that they know correspond to their intended recipients. So Charlie would give Bob's, Alice would give Dora's, and then the Bitcoin bath would mix together all of the money and then send it on to the intended recipients, severing the link between the sender and recipient. So then we also have receiver anonymity, which means that the senders can't determine which receiver is their intended receiver. They can just see, they know that the receiver that they desire to withdraw the money will get the money, but they can't find that mapping between the person that they know they're sending money to and the actual address on the blockchain. And this means, for example, they won't be able to follow their recipients' spending throughout the ledger, even if they have a view of it. So we've met these tumblers now, and they're the places where you send the money and hope for it to be forwarded on. But what does it mean for a tumbler to be trustless? Because just relying on them completely in exchange for hopefully getting some anonymity doesn't seem the best solution. So we want to achieve like certain properties. One of them is theft prevention, which means that this tumbler can't run away with the money or send it to a place where you don't want it to go. And then the next one is availability, which means that if the tumbler in some ways has enforcements to prevent it from stealing the money, maybe it can still make it unspendable, so it would just be frozen in some place, which is obviously also not ideal. So comparing the solutions that exist, the naive solution, which we introduced with the bath, achieves anonymity only modulo trusting the tumbler itself, because this person gets sent the money and the addresses, and they see where the money originally came from, so they know this mapping very obviously. And so if you can, for example, query that person, then you can reveal those links. Availability also modulo the tumbler, because they can go offline indefinitely and then your money would be frozen. Theft prevention is also modulo the tumbler. So if they wish just to like spend that money for themselves, you've given them the ability to do that. But in terms of communication and like frictionlessness, this rates pretty highly. So off-chain communications is just one. So the recipient needs to tell the sender their Bitcoin address that they want to receive the money to, just like normal. And on-chain transactions, this is two. So the sender needs to send the money to the tumbler, and then the tumbler forwards it on, which is really good. So then the next solution is Tumblebit, which was introduced in 2017 and uses RSA puzzles to allow the sender and receiver to interact with a central server off-chain in a way that money can transfer from the sender to the receiver in a way that not even the off-chain tumbler learns the mapping. So in this case, under some specific conditions, anonymity is achieved for all parties in question. Availability is still modulo the server. Like if they run away forever and never come back and don't want to interact anymore, then the money, the transactions just can't go through. But theft prevention in this case is guaranteed. But they pay for this in terms of communication. So off-chain, there are 12 interactions in total between like sender, tumbler, and recipient, and combinations of those three. And on-chain communications, this is 4, which can get expensive. So the next solution is CoinJoin, which we were introduced to in the last talk also. And in this way, what people do is broadcast their intention to spend some coins, but they wish to do so in an anonymous way, with enhanced anonymity. So they meet people off-chain in some way, and instead of sending a transaction which is signed, which is just from their single sender address to their single recipient's address, they make a combined transaction, which is to all of the intended from all of the intended sender addresses to all of the intended recipients. And then they pass this around and they all sign it. So availability is modulo the senders in this case, because if a person broadcasts their intention to create a transaction and then decides halfway through the transaction they no longer want to go through that and refuses to sign, then you have an availability problem. But once those signatures are completed, then the transaction will go through. So theft prevention is not an issue due to like properties of digital signatures, but in terms of off-chain communication, you really pay for this. You need to like meet these people who you've never met before in some way. You need to coordinate all of these transactions. You will need to be online at the same time to do these things. But on-chain transaction-wise, this is great. Then the next decentralized solution is XIM, which was introduced in 2014. It, again, receives anonymity for the senders, but they learn their recipient addresses. Availability is great, and the design of this protocol was such that it would require no off-chain communication. And they do this by communicating only on the Bitcoin blockchain, and they use it almost as a bulletin board. But in terms of, and they pay for this in terms of on-chain communication. So there's like 7 transactions that need to be done, and they need to be quite spread out. And so this is like an 11-hour process in total. So you can see the contrast between the more centralized solutions where there's a server sitting in between the sender and recipient, which pay for that in availability, and then the more decentralized solutions, which compromise in communications. In order to make up for these properties. So what we thought was, is this like an inherent thing? If you're doing a decentralized procedure, like, do you need to pay for it in terms of communication? And what we found was that using Ethereum, you don't actually have to make this compromise at all. So in this case, we get recipient anonymity, so the senders have the guarantee that the intended receivers will be able to withdraw the money, but they don't learn which receiver is their specific receiver. Availability guaranteed by the Ethereum blockchain. Theft prevention is guaranteed by like the protocol itself. Off-chain communications is 2. The caveat is a positive one, because these 2 communications are a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which then, if you want to repeatedly transact with the same people, you will never need to communicate with them off-chain again. You can just derive new keys and use the protocol in that way. And on-chain communications, it's 2, and again, it's like to a tumbler, away from a tumbler. So how do we achieve these properties? So the first thing that we use is Ethereum smart contracts and ring signatures. And if you don't know how ring signatures work, pretty much they, like a normal digital signature, has a public and private key combination, and your signatures produced by the private key verify against the public key. Ring signatures, you instead take a group of public keys, and signatures produced by either of the private keys verify against the whole group of public keys in a way that doesn't reveal which of the public keys your private key corresponds to. So the idea of Möbius is that senders and receivers will communicate, so that the senders have the public key of their intended recipients, and they'll deposit this key into a smart contract along with some agreed denomination of money. Then the next thing that happens will be, obviously, once the agreed upon number of senders have deposited money, so this is how you form your anonymity set, then the smart contract will be in this state with all of the keys in. Then the intended recipients can form these ring signatures over the set of public keys, and they can withdraw money in this way. So the way I've presented it here, however, has a slight issue in that if, for example, Dora was offline, then Bob could create this ring signature, and because of the properties of ring signatures, like unlinkability, he would be able to withdraw one coin and then he would be able to withdraw the other one if Dora hadn't submitted her signature in time. And so what we do is we use linkable ring signatures, so we keep track of the signatures that have already been seen. And linkable ring signatures have this additional property that even though you still can't identify which public key, private key, which public key, the private key that the signature was formed with corresponds to, there's like a deterministic tag that is associated with the signature, and every signature that Bob will produce will have this same tag. And so if we keep the signature in the smart contract, then Bob can't produce more than one signature, he can't withdraw more than once. And so you have this guarantee that every sender will have exactly the recipient withdraw exactly the money that they sent them. Then in terms of communication, because sending back and forth keys every time is like something which you don't have to do if you use, for example, fiat, we wanted to produce an optimization which allowed people to have the same, if you have transacted with someone once, you can transact with them again without having to do all of this communication. And so we use this concept that's called stealth addresses, or in this case we use the stealth keys. And the stealth keys, how they work is that the recipients will have long-term public keys, but these won't be the keys that are deposited into the smart contract. Instead, keys will be derived by the sender in this deterministic way so that the receiver will be able to derive the corresponding private keys every time without having to interact. And if you're interested, this is how they're constructed from the master public keys, which would be the receiver's long-term known public keys. And in this way, between contracts, like if you transact on one day and another, you're not linked, but you don't have to do that additional communication. So we implemented this. It's pretty extremely reasonable. So the deposit transaction takes pretty much no time at all to create, is like not very much more expensive than a plain Ethereum transaction, and the withdrawal transaction takes like a little longer, but still only on the scale of milliseconds, and is, we think, extremely reasonable in terms of like real life cost. Then here is the comparison again to conclude. So we've introduced Möbius, which achieves like great things in terms of availability and theft prevention, but then without compromising on the communication. Which hopefully will encourage people to mix more often. And that's all. Thanks.
We have time for questions.
Thanks, interesting work. In your table, if you just go back one, I just had a question about what is the availability problem with CoinJoin?
Oh, so it's just if during the construction of the transaction and then also like when you're all signing the transaction and passing it around and when you're collecting all of those signatures, if any person decides not to sign, you have to start from the beginning again.
But you don't lose the coins.
Right, exactly. So
Okay.
no, yeah, exactly. It's just an inconvenience thing. That's
Okay.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Any more questions? Thank you, Rebekah.
Thanks.